They say betrayal cuts deepest not when it comes from enemies, but when it comes from the hands you trusted to serve you. For Adrian Cole, a billionaire CEO who had faced market crashes, hostile takeovers, and the cold dismissal of his own father, nothing prepared him for what waited inside a restaurant he secretly owned. That night, dressed in a navy hoodie and worn sneakers, he stepped into the cradle not as the powerful executive whose signature could move millions, but as an ordinary man. He wanted to see with his own eyes if the whispers were true that in his very own house of fine dining, people who did not look the part were quietly humiliated. The hostess glanced at him with the kind of look that strips a man down to nothing but assumptions. Instead of guiding him to the grand dining room with chandeliers glittering overhead, she led him to a cramped seat near the kitchen doors where the smell of bleach leaked out every time they swung open. Adrian said nothing, though the humiliation stung sharper than the draft slipping through the hallway. When he ordered the most expensive steak on the menu, the manager appeared, his tone heavy with suspicion. His eyes slid up and down Adrian's plain clothes as if wealth only wore tailored suits. Around them, waiters exchanged glances and whispered. In their minds, the logic was simple: a gay man, dressed like that, could not possibly belong in a place built on polished marble and quiet superiority. Adrian lifted his glass of water to steady himself. He had lived this gaze before, the one that said, "You are not enough. You do not belong. You never will." He could have walked out, but something inside told him to stay. He wanted the truth. The plate arrived. The steak glistened under the dim light, perfectly seared, perfectly staged. He raised his fork, ready to cut into it, when a hand brushed against his table. It was Emily, a young waitress with trembling fingers, her face pale beneath the glow of the candle. She slid a folded napkin toward him as if delivering contraband. Adrian opened it, and the words hit him like ice. "They spit in your food. This place isn't safe. They hate people like you." For a moment, the sounds of clinking glasses and murmured conversation blurred into silence. Adrian's fork hovered midair. The napkin lay heavy in his palm, not just paper, but proof. A scarlet letter exposing the rot beneath the silk curtains of the cradle. His chest tightened, not from anger alone, but from the haunting echo of memories he thought he had buried long ago. The night was no longer about a steak. It was about dignity, about survival, about the reminder that no matter how high he had climbed, some people still saw him as less than human. Emily's eyes darted nervously toward the kitchen. She knew she had risked her job by warning him, but she also knew the cruelty she had witnessed couldn't remain hidden. Adrian wanted to speak, to ask her why, but the words lodged in his throat. Instead, he folded the napkin again, as if hiding it might also hide the truth. Yet the truth was already spreading through him like fire. What Adrian didn't know was that this single act, the courage of a waitress and the cowardice of those behind the kitchen doors, would ignite a storm powerful enough to shake not just a restaurant, but an entire industry built on appearances. He had come searching for whispers. Instead, he found his own reflection staring back at him in the ugliest way. That night, in the hum of the cradle, Adrian Cole realized that prejudice wears a tuxedo as easily as it wears rags. And the battle he thought he had left behind in his childhood had followed him here, to a linen-covered table under the guise of sophistication, because hatred doesn't need to shout. Sometimes, it hides behind a smile, waiting for the moment to spit into your food. If you're listening to this story and believe that truth should never be swallowed in silence, stay with us. This is only the beginning of Adrian's fight. Subscribe to Heart Stories, where stories like his find a voice, and where silence is never the final word. And remember, sometimes the smallest warning, written on a napkin, can be the spark that forces the world to finally look at itself. The napkin remained folded in Adrian Cole's pocket long after he left the cradle that night. Its weight felt heavier than the gold watch on his wrist, heavier even than the empire he carried on his shoulders. He had survived decades of battles in boardrooms, but this was different. This was intimate. He had been warned that in the kitchen, the very heart of his own restaurant, men spat into food because they despised people like him. And when he asked to see the truth for himself, he found only silence and erasure. The next morning, Adrian returned without disguise. His name alone made the staff stand straighter, but the memory of their whispers was still fresh. He asked the manager to pull the footage from the kitchen camera at the time his meal was prepared. A simple request, one he had every right to make as owner. The manager hesitated, eyes flickering with guilt before leading him into the security office. On the monitor, files appeared, timestamps neatly lined up. But when the moment arrived, the feed cut to black. A gap of several minutes stretched where there should have been motion and sound. Adrian leaned closer, staring at the void on the screen. He did not need confirmation. The absence itself was the answer. Someone had deleted the evidence. Not an accident, not a glitch. A choice, a system that protected cruelty instead of confronting it. He stepped outside the dim office into the bright corridor, the sunlight slanting through tall windows. And in that beam of light, his mind did what it often did in moments of humiliation. It pulled him backward to another day, another betrayal. He was 12 years old again, standing on the front lawn of his childhood home. His father's voice sharp as the crack of a whip. The man he had once adored was throwing a trash bag stuffed with clothes onto the sidewalk. His mother stood in the doorway, refusing to meet his eyes. The reason was simple and merciless: he had come out as gay. Adrian remembered clutching the bag, trembling in the current while the door slammed shut behind him. He had no home, no place to belong. That night marked the start of years spent proving himself worthy not just of shelter, but of respect. He studied harder than his classmates, worked longer hours than his peers, and built walls so high that no insult could climb them. Yet here he was, decades later, facing the same sneer in a different form. Wealth and power had not erased the prejudice that once left him shivering on a sidewalk. Emily found him in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear. She whispered that she had seen it before: same staff, same malice. She had watched two women holding hands pushed to the back of the dining room while others were escorted to the best tables. She had seen meals returned to the kitchen, only to be tampered with before being served again. She had heard the laughter of cooks mocking men whose voices were too soft or clothes too colorful. Each time she wanted to speak, but fear sealed her lips, until the night she saw Adrian, alone with his steak, unaware of the poison hidden in contempt. Listening to her, Adrian felt both fury and sorrow. Fury that his restaurant had become a stage for cruelty. Sorrow that Emily, young and idealistic, had been forced into complicity by silence. Her confession was a mirror of his own past: the bystanders who looked away while he was bullied, the relatives who said nothing when his father cast him out. Silent, he realized, is the first ally of prejudice. He thanked her quietly, though gratitude felt too small for the courage it had taken her. As she stepped back into the dining room, Adrian stood still, his reflection staring at him from the polished glass wall. The boy with the trash bag and the man in the tailored suit were one and the same. Both had been told they did not belong. Both had been tested by the cruelty of others. The lesson was clear: prejudice does not fade with time, and silence does not soften its edge. It survives through systems that erase evidence, through laughter in kitchens, through the quiet fear of witnesses. Adrian understood that he could not allow silence to rule his house. Not again, not here, not now. When dawn broke the following day, the secret Adrian Cole had carried into the cradle could no longer remain his alone. The folded napkin, the erased footage, and the memories it had awakened, everything demanded to be brought into the light. He arrived at the restaurant not in disguise, but with his name and face uncovered. A man unwilling to hide in the shadows of his own empire. In front of the staff, Adrian announced the truth: he was not just a guest at the cradle, he was its owner. The murmurs that followed rippled like waves crashing against stone. The manager turned pale. The bolder employees fell silent, and the servers shifted nervously, realizing that the man they had dismissed the night before held the keys to the entire establishment. Yet Adrian's revelation was not for them alone. Within hours, an official statement was drafted and sent to the press. He laid bare what had happened. A gay CEO had been demeaned in the very place that bore his signature. And when he asked for proof, the evidence had been destroyed. The story caught fire. News anchors repeated his name with a mixture of astonishment and condemnation. Headlines declared the hypocrisy of a fine dining restaurant that marketed luxury but harbored contempt behind its doors. Images began to surface, grainy but clear enough, showing moments when the kitchen staff laughed as plates were altered, when managers smirked while LGBT customers were sent to the least desirable corners of the dining room. Former employees came forward, their voices emboldened by the courage of one waitress. They recounted patterns of mockery, deliberate delays, and cruel games played at the expense of dignity. The cradle, once a jewel of sophistication, became a symbol of something rotten. Social media erupted. Hashtags calling for accountability spread faster than any marketing campaign ever could. Members of the LGBT community voiced their anger, recounting their own experiences of quiet humiliations in spaces meant for joy. For many, Adrian's revelation became more than a scandal. It became proof of what they had endured silently for years. But not all voices were supportive. Among the applause, another chorus rose. Influential critics declared that a CEO who openly identified as gay would tarnish the brand. They warned of boycotts from conservative patrons, predicting empty dining rooms and sinking profits. Fear seeped into the boardroom of Adrian's corporation. The very men and women who had once celebrated his brilliance now whispered about damage control. To them, the scandal was not about truth or justice. It was about image. When the council of directors gathered, the air was thick with unease. Adrian listened as they urged him to step down, to remove himself for the sake of stability. They dressed their demands in polite language, but the core message was clear. His identity was the liability. He, not the staff who spat into food, not the managers who concealed the evidence, but the man who refused to remain silent about being gay. Adrian sat quietly as they spoke, their words washing over him with the same bitter chill as the night his father cast him out. He had clawed his way to success only to be told, once again, that who he was would never be acceptable. In that moment, he realized the battle was larger than himself. It was not just about a restaurant or even a corporation. It was about whether truth had a place in a world built on appearances. The storm outside the boardroom mirrored the storm online. Customers canceled reservations, not because Adrian had spoken up, but because the house had betrayed the very idea of hospitality. Yet in the chaos, something undeniable took root. People were listening. The silence that once shielded prejudice was breaking, replaced by voices demanding change. And within that noise lay a quiet lesson. Truth will always be inconvenient for those who profit from lies, but it is the only foundation strong enough to rebuild what prejudice has destroyed. Adrian knew that storms do not only tear down, sometimes they clear the sky for something better to rise. The storm of headlines had shaken every corner of Adrian Cole's empire, but where others saw scandal, Adrian saw a chance for resurrection. He walked through the doors of the cradle once more, not as a disguised patron, not as a shamed target, but as the rightful architect of what the restaurant could become. The marble floor that had once echoed with whispered ridicule would now carry a different weight dignity. Adrian made his decision clear: silence would not protect the brand, and retreat would not protect the truth. He refused to surrender his role or his voice. Instead, he declared that the cradle would be reborn, not as a shrine to exclusivity, but as a beacon of equality. The changes began immediately. The grand portraits of aristocrats that once lined the walls were replaced with images of historical figures who had dared to live authentically: writers, activists, and leaders whose names had too often been erased from polite memory simply because they were different. The dining rooms, once divided into corners of privilege and punishment, were opened with a new arrangement that placed respect above appearances. Employees who had participated in the culture of contempt were dismissed, and in their place came a staff chosen not for pedigree, but for character. Emily, The waitress whose small act of courage had exposed the truth was brought into Adrian's office one morning. She expected termination, or at best, a brief thank you before being sent on her way. Instead, Adrian told her she would become the Cradle's new director of culture and equity. Her role was to ensure no guest would ever again be humiliated under its roof, and no employee would ever again fear losing their job for speaking the truth. The tears in her eyes were not of fear this time, but of possibility, alongside the transformation of space and leadership. Adrian announced the creation of a new foundation, the Cradle of Pride, funded by his own wealth. The foundation would provide scholarships and housing support for LGBTQ+ students who had been cast out of their families. Just as he had once been, it would be more than charity. It would be a declaration that rejection could be met with opportunity and shame could be replaced with belonging. Reporters questioned his resolve. Investors muttered about the risks of alienating certain patrons. But Adrian spoke with the conviction that silenced their doubts. If a place once used to degrade people can stand again, then it must stand for justice. If these walls have witnessed cruelty, then they must now become the very foundation of fairness. The public watched as chandeliers still glittered above tables, but the spirit beneath them changed. Diners walked in uncertain and walked out with a sense that luxury need not come at the expense of respect. Families brought their children to see the portraits of pioneers they had never learned about in school. The Cradle, once infamous, became a living testament to renewal. In the quiet of his office, Adrian reflected on the boy he had been, standing outside his father's door with a trash bag of clothes. He imagined what it would have meant to know that somewhere in the world, a place existed where rejection turned into resilience. Now, through his choices, such a place did exist. The rebirth of the Cradle carried with it a truth that stretched beyond walls or menus. Justice is not merely punishing those who cause harm, but creating spaces where harm loses its power to thrive. It was a reminder that dignity is not a luxury reserved for a few, but the foundation upon which true belonging must always be built. The day of reckoning arrived inside the polished glass tower where Adrian Cole's board gathered. Outside, the city pulsed with voices, some in support, others calling for his resignation. Inside, tension coiled like a storm waiting to break. One by one, directors prepared to cast their votes on whether Adrian should remain at the helm of the empire he had built. To them, it was a matter of numbers, image, and shareholders. To Adrian, it was the culmination of every humiliation, every exile, every silence he had endured. As the ballots were read aloud, the decision leaned toward removing him. His stance, his identity, and his refusal to bend had convinced many that he was too much of a risk. Adrian sat still, his gaze unwavering. Though beneath his composure ran a current of memory, the boy abandoned at 12, the man who had eaten alone under chandeliers, the voice that had carried a truth too heavy for comfort. And then, as if history itself had turned its head, an unfamiliar voice broke through the monotony. One of the largest shareholders rose, his presence commanding the room. His face was older, lined by years, yet unmistakable to Adrian. It was Mr. Langford, his former high school teacher, the man who once stood between a frightened gay teenager and a group of bullies in a crowded hallway. Adrian had not seen him in decades. Langford's words cut through the silence. He revealed that years ago, after witnessing what Adrian endured, he had quietly followed his student's journey. When success arrived, he invested in Adrian's company, buying shares not for profit, but for principle. He had waited for this moment, a moment when his voice could matter in more than whispers. If I had stayed silent in that hallway, Langford said, Adrian might never have stood here today. Silence is what prejudice feeds on, and I will not stay silent now. The tide shifted. His declaration was not a plea, but a command, spoken with the authority of someone who knew what courage looked like when it was still fragile. Other members, shaken by the reminder of their own children, their own students, their own responsibilities, hesitated before changing their votes. By the end, Adrian's seat as CEO was not only preserved, it was affirmed with a force that silence could no longer erode. With the decision secured, Adrian turned his energy back to the cradle. Emily, now leading with conviction, balanced her new role with night classes in law, her tuition paid by the scholarship Adrian had founded. The restaurant's transformation became a model studied in universities, a case where dignity rewrote the story of luxury. At the press conference that followed, Adrian faced the cameras directly. He did not hide his voice nor soften its edge. The man you once spat upon, the man you dismissed as not belonging, is your CEO. I am a gay man, and I will not allow this place to serve only food. From today forward, it will serve truth, and it will serve humanity. The room erupted in flashes of cameras and murmurs, but beneath the chaos lay something steady, an undeniable acknowledgement that change had taken root. Adrian's journey had carved a lesson deeper than scandal or victory, that power is not in erasing who we are, but in declaring it. Prejudice can sit in gilded rooms, dressed in respectability, but it crumbles when even one voice dares to call it by its name. And so the boy with a trash bag, the man with a folded napkin, and the leader standing at a podium became one story, the story of resilience reborn. Do you believe, like Adrian, that silence feeds prejudice? Tell us your thoughts below. And if you want more stories where truth rises from the shadows, subscribe to Heart Stories, because here, dignity always has a voice.